From sunrise to sunset, slaves endured brutal conditions, lived under the threat of family separation, inhumane beatings, and cruel, unjust punishment. Throughout the early development of America, African Americans often fought an upwards battle against the slave system and discrimination. They were denied their basic legal rights, were forbidden from any reading or writing of the sort, and had their movement restricted through chains. Life as a slave was a treacherous fight in which African Americans had to wrestle with daily, having to wake up at the crack of dawn, restless and paranoid at the possible punishment they could receive. The cruel treatment that enslaved people had to undergo was an incredibly tiresome and perpetual cycle in which slaves had to deal with every second of the day. Despite the harsh reality, they triumphed and persevered through the struggle, gaining legal rights slowly but surely and solidifying their own culture in American society.
Daily routines of slaves were dictated by their masters, but the majority of the slaves' daily routine was doing field work from sunrise to sunset, which could last for about 14 hours a day. In the fields, slaves would perform tasks such as plowing, planting, and harvesting. Some other slaves who worked in homes would perform chores which include cleaning, cooking, laundry, and sewing. When being a slave, free time was extremely limited, and if slaves were to get free time, they would use it to visit family members on nearby plantations. After their workday, enslaved individuals had to return to their quarters to complete chores, such as preparing their own food and maintaining their living spaces before going to sleep. Even small children and the elderly weren't exempt from these long hours of labor. The elderly did less physically demanding tasks such as cooking, nursing, and sewing, but some were forced into different roles or left to suffer, but it depended on their masters. Small children would often perform various tasks, but as they grew older, their duties increased. As soon as they are able to walk and carry items, they are forced into labor. Enslaved children were essential to a successful economy and served not only to provide labor, but also to instill discipline and train them for a life of hard work and servitude.
The living conditions slaves had gone through were brutal, inhuman, and usually varied based on their importance to the slave master. Although the living conditions varied, all enslaved people were denied basic human rights and were only provided with what was necessary for survival. But even then, supplies that were provided were insufficient to live comfortably. In the houses slaves lived in, they were typically cramped into wooden shacks that had dirt floors in groups of up to 10 people. These cabins were extremely poor built, with gaps in the walls and roofs that allowed cold, wind, and rain to enter, which led to the lack of proper ventilation. For food, the enslaved were given inadequate amounts of food, as the main goal for the providers was to only provide just enough food to keep them alive and able to work, not to provide proper nutrition or enjoyment. Clothing that was worn was only provided, but not always, twice a year, and was typically made out of rough linen or cotton to give them a recognizable appearance. Overall, the living conditions for enslaved people were made up of inadequate housing, poor diet and nutrition, and harsh, intensive labor that varied based on where they worked and what role they played for their masters. The family structures of those that were enslaved in the colonies were usually resilient and strong because of their shared struggles. But their families were often under the risk of being broken apart and separated to be sold to different slave owners. These families had eventually adapted to being separated by forming social relationships to ensure community support and survival when being oppressed. Even if children and parents were separated from each other, family members such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, or even friends of the parents would take care of the children. Family members, and especially parents, tried to protect their children from the harsh realities of slavery for as long as possible to prevent childhood trauma and prepare them for survival. When getting married, legally they are not recognized as married because enslaved people couldn't enter legal contracts because of them being considered as property. Therefore, slaves weren't allowed to marry or form stable, secure families with other slaves. Usually, family members were sold at any moment that their owners needed because of what financial needs they may have, but led to lifelong trauma for the slaves.
Before, Africans were brutally forced from their homeland onto a cramped ship where they had to endure savage treatment of Americans through the Middle Passage and eventually adopted Western religions and traditions. They had their own way of life. In early America, a very small percentage of slaves were actually Christians, and in fact, some of them were Muslims at first. However, a vast majority stuck to their roots and practiced traditional African religions, which were animalistic in nature. Many of the religions and traditions were frowned upon in the Western world of America by colonial authorities, but even so, they still survived through several decades, leading to Africans born in America today still following such religions. Over time, though, Christianity overtook the African American population, which led to millions of Africans and their descendants becoming Christian. There were many famous abolitionists, such as Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who were deeply religious and followed Christianity, which influenced their actions and their views on slavery and politics. Often in American history, Christianity was used to excuse removing the natives, slavery, and many other negative things. Brave abolitionists such as Frederick Douglass, who were well educated in their religion, turned the tables on racist views and used the Bible to expose the cruel and unjust treatment towards slaves and African Americans.
Enslaved people used many strategies to resist slavery, both openly and secretly. Some forms of resistance were like working slowly or breaking tools to overt acts of rebellion, running away, and violence. Many people risked their lives to escape slavery through the Underground Railroad, guided by people like Harriet Tubman, who helped lead hundreds of people to freedom. Some like Frederick Douglass used literacy to escape slavery and later spoke out against slavery. Other people like Nat Turner started a rebellion to fight back directly against their oppressors, where he could take 70 of his followers and kill dozens of white men, women, and children as they moved from plantation to plantation. Small acts of refusing orders and protecting family members were acts of resistance which showed that enslaved people were not scared and determined to find freedom, but showed their courage and intelligence to fight slavery.
Overall, the lives of enslaved people were filled with unimaginable hardship, injustice, and suffering because of their exhausting and long work days, as well as how their poor living conditions due to their constant fear. The slaves' fear stemmed from how they had always lived under the threat of being separated from their families and their constant brutal punishments for the smallest things. Despite this, through African Americans' faith, community, and resilience, their descendants and new generations found ways to adapt, survive, and preserve their culture. Their strength in the face of oppression continues to shape American history and left a great mark, serving as a reminder to everyone about the importance of equality, justice, and remembering the struggles that built the foundation of the United States of America.